guys? It's the Mad Master here. So this video is going to be about what Bruce Dickinson has said about punk music in the last 6 months or so. And if you don't know, or if you haven't heard about this, basically, Iron Maiden's frontman Bruce Dickinson has said a lot of disparaging comments about the punk movement. Now, Iron Maiden have been accused, if you will, of at least their first two albums being influenced by punk rock. And Steve Harris has adamantly denied that several times, several interviews. Now, Paul Di'Anno, the former singer of Iron Maiden, has said he is influenced by punk. And, he said that, kind of hinted at, maybe that was kind of an influence on the early stuff. So here's one of the quotes from Bruce Dickinson. "The closest the art establishment ever came to embracing metal was punk. The reason they embraced punk was because it was rubbish, and the reason they embraced rubbish was because they could control it. They could say, oh yeah, we're punk so we can sneer at everybody. We can't play our fucking instruments, but that means we can make out this whole thing is some enormous performance art." So that's complete bullshit, first of all. Now, it is true that in Britain, punk was more embraced by some of the, maybe the left-wing establishment in Britain compared to the United States. But you had like the headlines with the Sex Pistols, shocking everybody, and it was kind of a sensationalist thing over there. So, and then goes on to say, half the kids who were in punk bands were laughing at the art establishment, going, what a fucking bunch of tosspots. Thank you very much. Give us money and we'll fuck off and stick it up our nose and shag birds. Now, that's just a completely erroneous assumption about punk music. Maybe when you're talking about like pop, like new wave bands, But what they really love to do is be in a heavy metal band surrounded by porn stars. What the fuck is he talking about? So basically, I just wanted to do this video because I think a lot of people have in metal sometimes an impression that punk music is just, that punk shit, especially when it comes down to like the more, more technical, more progressive kind of metal fans, So I think it's easy to say that if punk did not have an influence on metal that it has, metal would still basically sound like just a revved up version of new wave or British heavy metal. Now, that's a very controversial statement, but I'm just going to go into the countless examples. So, you have, punk music basically started in the 60s, believe it or not. It was a label for these garage bands that are on like these psychedelic hard rock compilations like Nuggets. They were these bands that, listen to some psychedelic stuff and like some R&B, and R&B back then, meaning, it was more related to rock and roll. And, they played a revved up version of that. So you had bands, that are on the Nuggets compilation, and, some of these bands, Iggy Pop. And, I would even say some of early Alice Cooper's 70s stuff is kind of punky too, or MC5 and bands like that. Now you had on the other side, you had bands like Led Zeppelin, Deep Purple, and Black Sabbath, which make, more the metal side, the roots of that. So, you have that punk side and that metal side. So, and MC5 were kind of in between, bands like that. So what happened was in the 70s, prog rock got big and heavy metal, so to speak, got pretty big too. But you had these bands that kind of veered towards the middle in the middle 70s, like, Dictators, which featured a future Manowar guitarist, Ross the Boss. And you had Motorhead, bands like that. And there were, some of these bands were speeding things up. Judas Priest had some fast songs, Scorpions or, UFO or whoever. But, some of these punk bands were speeding things up in the mid 70s and the late 70s. So a lot of these metal bands, or early metal bands and early punk bands like the Ramones and all that, influenced the hardcore punk movement, which basically, if that didn't exist, maybe I should do an addendum to the, what this video is about. But, if that didn't exist, metal would never have evolved beyond beyond New Ever British Heavy Metal or some similar things. So, I'll give you some examples like Black Flag and Bad Brains. Those guys listened to early metal and early punk and other stuff too. In the case of Black Flag, they listened to Grateful Dead and John Coltrane and Ornette Coleman and shit. So you had some of these guys in these bands that sped things up. They went beyond the Ramones, the Damned, and all that. So, and basically they weren't metal at that point, some of those bands, but it was obvious. There was a saturation from both sides going on, people being influenced by each other in these bands. And then it's simultaneously you had the post-punk thing, because the post-punk thing was basically a reaction to punk because they didn't want to play the cliched punk sound that a lot of people said that punk died the sound, so they went a little beyond it and incorporated other stuff like krautrock stuff, or avant-garde stuff, or more dissonant atonal stuff. So arguably that's an influence on metal as well. A lot of gothic rock came about that, and gothic rock was an influence on a lot of metal. So you had bands, even you have like the Swans or Crass had influenced Napalm Death. These bands that did all this stuff. Actually, Napalm Death started as a punk band. They started as a one of those sort of D-beat or crust punk kind of bands. So they kind of evolved from there and got faster and faster and incorporated more metal influences, and then became what was known as grindcore, and then grindcore influenced in turn death metal with a lot of its sound. So, going back, you can go back to Discharge, bands like that, and a lot of the beats that Discharge used, thrash bands picked up, and whether it be Metallica, Anthrax, or whoever, like a case in point is Overkill. So Overkill started in like '81, and they were an early band. They did metal and punk covers together in their early days, and then they started playing speed metal, that incorporated influences of both. And another case in point is Bathory. So Bathory is an influence on all of extreme metal, I would argue, because death metal, black metal, Viking metal, you name it, it was influenced by Bathory. And Bathory, you listen to Motorhead and Venom. Motorhead was arguably be like punk metal kind of hybrid to a lot of people, by the way. And obviously Motorhead influenced Venom, so I mean, it just goes on and on. I can't fucking like, I could go on for hours in this video. Hopefully it's going to be a shorter video this time around. But so Bathory, he says, well, yeah, I don't think he was being truthful when he said, Quorthon, the leader of Bathory, when he said all he listened to was like Charged GBH was like early punk band from early 80s that influenced. I mean, you listen to that band, and their vocal style is actually kind of similar in a way. It's, of course, a little bit more evil sounding with Quorthon, but I mean, I can hear the influence right away when I heard it. So, it just it runs the gamut. I mean, DRI is an example. So, arguably, Eric Brecht from DRI invented the blast beat. And the blast beat has been used in every kind of extreme metal and even some other types of metal, too. I mean, I think Dragon Force used a few blast beat. I mean, he didn't invent the blast beat as far as like maybe there's some jazz guy that did it before or something, but just like Eddie Van Halen didn't invent tapping, but kind of popularized that beat, because actually Eric Brecht, after DRI, who was a punk band that crossed over to metal, after DRI he joined Death, which actually, strangely enough, I'm wearing their shirt today. So, I mean, if you want to look at the cross-cultural exchange between punk and metal, it was very much a thing even in the early 80s, late 70s. I mean, and the post-punk thing, obviously the avant-garde influences really permeated metal with more atonal kind of stuff, or tritones, or just different types of things that post-punk bands were doing that influenced a lot of metal musicians. So when Bruce Dickinson says all this stuff about punk, he's just totally unaware of the breadth of influence that it's had. I mean, thrash metal is basically hardcore punk meets New Wave of British heavy metal. And ask a member of Metallica that, they would tell you that right away. I mean, how many covers of punk bands did they do? Like fucking 20, 10 punk covers and like 10 new ever British heavy metal band covers. I mean, it's obviously such a bullshit assumption that punk is like some rubbish thing. So, and it goes, goes for the people that deny the influence of punk too. Like, oh, I hate punk. Yeah, it's like, you're not even looking at history. You could say I don't like punk music or whatever, but to deny the influence that it's had on metal over the years, it's kind of like I think punk and metal are kind of like cousins that exchange. Maybe they're like. I mean, it's kind of sounds like incest, but maybe they have sex every once in a while and have a kid. These cousins. But I mean, that's basically what they are. But they're at odds, but at the same time, they're very related. Punk influenced the thrash thing. Political stuff included. You look at all the lyrics of a lot of the '80s thrash bands. Nuclear Assault were kind of a punk crossover metal. I mean, it's just I could go on so much in this video and say that Bruce Dickinson is full of shit about punk, and metalheads that are snobby about it are full of shit. But you just look at history. Just do your fucking homework. Do your research. If you don't believe me, just go to Wikipedia, go to Metal Archives, go to fucking forums, listen to the music itself even more, on YouTube or wherever, and do the research for yourself. Punk didn't influence metal, or punk's just all rubbish and it died. What do you mean by punk? Of course, I mean, if you're talking about like the cheesiest like Ramones song, then I can see what you're talking about. But all these bands, they influenced each other, and read any interview with James Hetfield, Bobby Blitz, or fucking Quorthon, or Voivod, or fucking Nuclear Assault, or Napalm Death, or Carcass. Carcass were, all the whole grind thing, just fucking goes on and on. I could go on and on in this video. So that's about it. I just hope people don't take those comments of Bruce Dickinson to heart and just recognize the ignorance that he has about punk music, and he doesn't know what the fuck he's talking about.